Groups can look very racist, even if the individuals inside them aren't. Intuitively, that doesn't really seem to make sense, and yet this is exactly what Nobel Prize-winning economist Thomas Schelling demonstrated. Now, to be clear, this video is not about racist ideas. It's about something much more general, and I think much more useful. It's about how we sometimes stumble upon ideas suddenly help us make sense of things we experience every day. Ideas that allow us to step back and change the way we see the world, how we move through it. Ideas that have the potential to change our lives, even if we sometimes don't realize that just yet. But first, let's briefly go back to what Schelling showed. Now, imagine you live in a mixed-race neighborhood. You like multiculturalism. You're perfectly happy as long as you're not the only person of your race in the area. 50-50 is fine, even less than that. 30% is enough to feel comfortable. Otherwise, you'd move away. This little simulation visualizes such a scenario. You can see a mix of red and white dots, and there are some empty slots that people can move to if they are unhappy in their current location. What Schelling demonstrated is that even if everyone holds this seemingly quite tolerant preference, the system still evolves into highly segregated neighborhoods, much more segregated than anyone actually individually wanted. When I first heard this, it completely blew my mind. How could tolerant people end up producing such an intolerant-looking outcome? The key implication here is subtle but profound. Individual preferences can lead to group outcomes that look nothing like those preferences. This means that when we look at groups, we can't simply assume they reflect the beliefs or intentions of the individuals inside them. I had held this assumption for quite a long time, but good people create good groups, and bad groups must be made up of bad people. Schelling's model breaks that assumption. It shows how our intuition can be fooled even just with simple rules. At different levels of abstraction, different rules apply. Beliefs that hold at one level don't automatically carry over to another. I later encountered similar patterns in many other places. Try and predict how a bird swarm or school of fish behaves. It seems incredibly complex, so it surely should require incredibly complex rules. But decent simulations of bird swarms can be created with just 3 simple rules: separation, alignment, and cohesion. Take a look at this animation. The birds are avoiding crowding with nearby birds, they align with their direction, and they move towards the center of the group. 3 simple rules. And yet, from these something incredibly complex and beautiful emerges. Once you see this pattern, you start noticing it everywhere. To be honest, it still doesn't quite feel right to me how such simple rules can produce such rich behavior. But that confusion points to something important. Complexity is everywhere in the natural world, and because of that, it's extremely hard to predict what will happen next. We can feel lost, overwhelmed, and we keep hearing about how the world is getting more complex by the day. Most of us seem to be hard-coded to believe that big outcomes require big efforts. Complex situations have complex explanations, strong people will create strong groups, and so on and so forth. So if the world is becoming ever more complex, our lives will become ever more difficult. This intuition results from generally reasonable assumptions. But surprisingly, in many areas of life, this is not correct. And once someone, not necessarily us, but anyone, manages to uncover the underlying rules governing some difficult phenomena, suddenly the world becomes more legible, more predictable, easier to navigate. Understanding these rules is extremely difficult. Most of us won't be able to derive them from first principles, but applying them is often much simpler and available to all of us. This is where my fascination with ideas really comes from. I remember being a small kid on a family walk, probably complaining as usual about something at school, when my father said to me, "Jonas, Remember, small people talk about other people. Average people talk about events. Great people talk about ideas. Now, I don't know whether I was genuinely inspired or just wanted my father's approval, but I remember thinking quite clearly I'd better start thinking about ideas. Over the past 20 years, my work and travel has stretched across more than 50 countries and many industries, including spending time in tech, retail, travel, and even as a banking CEO. I've been closely involved in about $100 million of investment deals and have experienced my fair share of both successes and failures, working with thousands of people to serve millions of customers. I don't say this to boast, but to provide context, because despite all of that, some of my happiest moments, professionally and personally, some of the biggest breakthroughs were when I stumbled upon a new idea that suddenly made something click. That light bulb moment where you think, that makes sense. Even better, I found that a light bulb moment in one area often led me to taking a step back and trying to apply that new idea to an existing problem I was facing in a different context or company as well. And more often than not, this led me to interesting new angles to explore. That is when I truly understood something else. Ideas compound. Einstein is often, probably incorrectly, but quoted as saying that compound interest is the greatest force in the universe. Usually when people use this quote, they talk about money. 1 cent invested 2,000 years ago at a mere 2% annual return would be worth over $1.5 quadrillion today. But money is hard to earn, and I don't have 2,000 years' time. Compounding 6, 7, or even 8% annually on too small of a base still leaves you with almost nothing for a very long time. Ideas, on the other hand, are surprisingly cheap to acquire. You can find them in books, in scientific papers, from friends and mentors, online, in videos like this, and they're usually non-depleting. My money is my money, and if I gift it to you, it will become your money. But ideas are different. Sure, some are proprietary secrets, but most can be shared, reused, and built upon. And in the long run, knowledge and the biggest ideas tend to come out into the open, even if they are closely guarded at the moment. So think of ideas like Lego blocks. The more of them you collect, the more you can play around with them and explore what they can do for you. The more you can build, whether you discover them yourself or somebody else shows you how. The more ideas you collect, the larger your baseline becomes. And suddenly, more and more observations start to make sense. So instead of just talking about great ideas, we should seek them and play with them, curate them, and use them to live happier lives, because ideas really have the power to do so. Now, after this love letter to the power of ideas, allow me to take a step back and build more on the earlier examples of the connection between ideas and outcomes. Specifically, let me explore how simple rules can explain complex outcomes and how to use this insight to help us in our everyday lives. First, though, we must lay the foundation by looking at 4 different definitions that reshaped how I think about some core aspects of life: wealth, knowledge, confidence, and suffering. The idea here is that if we cannot even properly define it, have a right vocabulary to talk about it, it is very hard to take control of it and improve it. I should be honest up front. I'm sure these definitions are wrong. Still, I use them all the time, even though I assume they'll be replaced by something better someday. Because I find them wrong but useful. And we all use such wrong but useful ideas constantly. Newtonian mechanics are incomplete and incorrect at certain scales, yet incredibly useful. Assuming an idea is universally correct often prevents us from being open for even better explanations. It shuts our minds to the possibilities of new ideas, blocked by our own stubborn beliefs that our current ideas are correct. We get complacent with what we have. instead of remaining playful in our approach, continuously looking for even better ideas. But back to these 4 foundations. Let's start with wealth. What does it even mean to be wealthy? Long ago, I thought being rich and being wealthy is the same, that it means having a lot of money. But wealth is not just having a lot of money. And it's not simply what you own. Take all the money from a wealthy person, yet they likely will not be ruined for life. Because of that, I like David Deutsch's definition of wealth. Wealth is the set of transformations available to you at a given point in time. That is admittedly a bit of an abstract way of putting it, but let me explain. Imagine you're a medieval king. You have land, gold, maybe even coal or oil, and yet the things you can do with these resources are very limited. You can't use your gold to talk to your brother on the other side of the country in real time. That transformation simply doesn't exist. Today, because of accumulated knowledge, it does. So increasing wealth isn't just about increasing money. It's about increasing what's possible for you to turn into reality with the knowledge and resources you have available. And this directly leads to knowledge. Here, I will focus on explanatory knowledge, the set of explanations I have available to me that help me make sense of as many phenomena as possible. Can I explain what I'm seeing, what I'm experiencing? Full knowledge under this definition would mean me being able to make sense of any past, present, and future thing I observe. Can I understand why something happened? And can I then take the next step and predict outcomes instead of just making sense of what I see? Can I predict that if I do this, then that will happen? This is closely linked to Judea Pearl's idea of a ladder of causation. If I throw spaghetti into boiling water, I know they will soften. I know the sun will rise in the east. These things make sense to me. Where something doesn't make sense, fashion, for example, I know I have a knowledge gap. And even where we think we understand something, life keeps producing new data points that test our explanations, our knowledge. I know Arsenal is the best football team in the world, but if they keep finishing second, I might need to question that knowledge. Next comes confidence. For me, confidence is the proportion of future scenarios I believe I can successfully deal with. If I travel to a country where I don't know the language and have no friends, I imagine various scenarios. Finding food, getting to the hotel, navigating transport. If I believe I'll figure it out, I feel confident. If I can't imagine handling those situations, anxiety sets in. This is obviously a mundane example, but the same idea holds true if we take a step back and look at the bigger picture of our life. If I lose my job, am I okay? If something happens to my family, will we be okay? If global politics lead to something entirely out of my control, like war, will we be okay? What about in a global pandemic? If we are well set up to survive, to strive under any such circumstances, we can be confident. But sometimes what looks like confidence is really ignorance when we can't imagine failure at all. How to move a more enlightened view on true versus fake confidence is a topic for another day. Finally, suffering. Computer science professor Aapo Hyväinen, and I'm pretty sure I mispronounced him, he wrote an excellent book called Painful Intelligence: What AI Can Tell Us About Human Suffering. It is an example for how exploring one area, AI, can lead to surprising insights in other areas like psychology. In it, he builds a rather elaborate argument that suffering can be described through a formula. Suffering here is calculated as the result of expectation versus reality multiplied by the certainty of judgment, the attention given to it, and how often it's relived. For example, I may have just missed the bus and now have to wait 10 minutes for the next one. But if I keep beating myself up over it, why didn't I leave earlier? I will suffer much more than if I just accept it. Or maybe my judgment of this being a bad thing could turn out to be wrong in the long run. If that earlier bus ends up in a fatal accident, I would have been lucky to have missed it. What makes this idea powerful is that it immediately suggests intervention points, resetting expectations, breaking cycles of rumination, redirecting attention. Simple components to describe something incredibly complex. And once we can define something precisely, we can begin to act on it. How exactly becomes a breeding ground for many more ideas. But again, I find it incredible that something as complex as suffering can even be attempted to be broken down into a simple formula as per Huverinen's ideas. What I like about all four of these definitions is that they are simple but allow you to play around with their core ideas. You can explore implications for our complex world. If wealth is how many things one can do, a dying billionaire suddenly may seem less wealthy than a healthy mid-aged middle-class person. And regarding their own health, that surely is true. No money in the world currently can transform dead back to alive. Having said that, a grieving wealthy person may transform the world by building a beautiful monument to their love like the Taj Mahal in India. It's fun to play around with ideas like this, taking a step back and marveling at how simple ideas suddenly can lead to surprising observations and explain things previously unexplainable. But for all the excitement, there is one worry I've carried for a long time: forgetting what I've learned. I've always believed in first principles. I may forget some details, but with the right foundation, I should be able to reproduce what I need. But how far back can you really go? At some point, radio, internet, GPS, they all reduce to Maxwell's equations on electromagnetism, which is true but not really useful, as going from them to these inventions still took 100 to 200 years and dozens, if not hundreds, of geniuses. It's not just a few simple rules from Maxwell to the internet. This is where Daniel Dennett's phrase gave me a lot of peace: competence without comprehension. You don't need to permanently totally understand everything to become or remain effective. For example, I know how to drive a car without understanding the full chemistry of combustion. If the car doesn't start, some comprehension would help me make sense of what's going on. It could be an issue with fuel, battery, ignition, but no one truly understands every layer. Understanding the how can be sufficient. Not everything must be understood at the why level too to be useful. And that's okay. Because again, ideas act like building blocks. If you keep using the same powerful ideas across different contexts, they strengthen. They become harder to forget. They don't exist in isolation anymore. Rather, the relationship between them gives a robust structure for them to reside. As the cognitive scientist Daniel Willingham says, memory is the residue of thought. So if we think about them, play with them, use them, we form stronger memories. As I prepared this video, I realized that discovering ideas gives me a similar joy to traveling. When you visit a new place and see something you could never have imagined, your horizon expands. You can't unsee it. In travel, we often rely on guides, locals, friends, recommendations to enrich the experience. Of course, you can just wander around randomly, and sometimes that's wonderful. But more often, guidance deepens the journey. In the world of ideas, where are those guides? Teachers, of course, exist, but Learning often replaces joy with duty. Why can't discovering ideas feel more like exploring a city? Fun, exciting, sometimes tiring, but ultimately rewarding. Looking back at my father's lesson, I take it a step further. The great people I've been fortunate to meet, they don't just talk about ideas, they seek them out, they curate them. They use ideas to increase their knowledge, their wealth, their confidence, and to minimize their suffering. They do it playfully with curiosity and joy, and that sounds to me like a life worth living. So I hope you can see the magic of curating ideas. With these ideas as a foundation, there is so much more to explore. In a future episode, I'll share how I've come to see life itself as a data-generating process, constantly producing signals that invite better explanations. If you made it this far, thank you. And if you've ever had a moment where an idea suddenly made the world feel more ordered, you had that light bulb go off, I'd love to hear about it in the comments.